My captor, the Alpha King, doesn't need chains to keep me here. He just needs to breathe. Every night he sits in the chair across from my bed, the storm of his cursed power finally quiet, his eyes never leaving my face. He thinks this is his prison, but he's about to learn what true chaos is when the one thing that can soothe his demons decides to become one herself. Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. The lukewarm water sloshed in the bucket, smelling faintly of bleach and regret. Outside the diner's grimy window, a family piled out of a minivan, their laughter a bright, piercing sound that felt like it belonged to another world. A little girl with sunshine yellow ribbons in her hair skipped on the pavement, her father scooping her into his arms and spinning her around until she squealed. A cold weight settled deep in Cora's chest, heavy and familiar as her own heartbeat. That easy affection, that effortless belonging. It was a language she'd heard her whole life but could never learn to speak. Her world was one of shadows and whispers, of being a glitch in the moon goddess's grand design. She was a void, wolfless, a shifter who couldn't shift, forever trapped on the outside of the fierce, vibrant connection that bound her people together. Her family loved her, she knew, but it was a pained, worried kind of love, the kind you give to something beautiful but broken. That little girl with the yellow ribbons had no idea how lucky she was to just be, to be whole. Hey, shell girl, mop faster. Them floors ain't gonna clean themselves. Brenda's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and grating as rusted metal. Cora didn't look up, just clenched her jaw and pushed the mop with more force, the swish, swish, swish across the linoleum a rhythm for her resentment. Shell girl. The nickname had followed her from the Packlands into the human town, a constant reminder. All she wanted was to save enough money to finally disappear, to find some quiet, anonymous city where no one knew what a wolf was, let alone a girl born without one. A place where she could be judged for the strength in her hands, not the silence in her soul. Finishing her shift, the setting sun painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth from the woods that bordered the town, a scent that always made her feel a pang of homesickness for a home that was never truly hers. It was there, tacked to the diner's community board between a flyer for a lost cat and an ad for cheap firewood, that she saw it. The official pack summons, embossed with the silver moon crest. Its elegant script felt like a judgment. Mandatory attendance, full moon mating ceremony. Her stomach twisted into a knot of ice and dread. Tonight. The ceremony she had been praying would never come. Following the summons was unavoidable because a rejection of the Alpha's call was a rejection of the pack itself, an act of treason. So she walked home, the gravel crunching under her worn-out boots, each step heavier than the last. Her small cabin at the edge of the Packlands was more of a shack, really, but it was hers. Inside, it smelled of dried herbs and old books, a fortress of solitude she had built for herself. Lying on her cot was the dress her mother had insisted she take. It was simple, made of pale, moon-white cotton, a stark contrast to the colorful embroidered dresses the other shifter girls would be wearing. It was a dress for a ghost, a dress for a girl who wasn't really there. Did her mom know something she didn't? Or was this just another gentle reminder of her otherness? As she held the fabric, a strange, cold draft snaked through the cabin, making the lone candle on her table flicker wildly, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls that looked for a moment like grasping claws. Chapter 2. A Promise of Ash. The ceremonial grounds buzzed with energy, a current that vibrated up through the soles of Cora's thin slippers. Torches hissed and spat, casting a flickering golden glow on the faces of her pack. They were beautiful, vibrant people, their eyes already beginning to gleam with the light of their inner wolves, their laughter loud and unrestrained. The air was thick with the scent of pine smoke, roasting meat, and the electric tang of anticipation. It was a celebration of life, of connection, of the sacred bond between mates. And for Cora, it felt like a funeral. She stood at the edge of the crowd, trying to make herself as small as possible, a gray rock in a river of jewels. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and fear. Hope, because Liam, her fated mate, the future alpha, had promised her. He had sworn to her under the stars that her being a void didn't matter. "It's you, Cora," he'd whispered, his voice warm and sincere, his hand over his heart. "I feel the pull. It's you." That promise was the single, fragile thread she clung to. But fear. Fear was a cold, coiling serpent in her gut, whispering that a promise was just a breath of air, easily broken. Just as the thought surfaced, Liam appeared before the pack, stepping onto the central platform. He was everything an alpha should be: tall, broad-shouldered, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His eyes, a startling blue, scanned the crowd, and for a terrifying second, they met hers. She saw a flicker of something in their depths. Was it pity? Regret? Before she could decide, he looked away, his expression hardening into a mask of regal duty. He gave her a slight shake of his head, a gesture so small no one else would notice, but to her, it was a seismic tremor, a warning. What did that mean? The serpent of fear in her stomach tightened its coils. He approached her then, his steps deliberate, his presence parting the crowd like a ship through water. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze not quite meeting hers. "Cora," he began, his voice low, pitched for her ears alone. "We need to talk, after the ceremony." His words were calm, but a strange current of unease rippled from him, a discordant note in the symphony of the pack's excitement. She could almost taste his anxiety, metallic and sharp like blood on the tongue. Was he nervous about claiming her? Or something else entirely? Why did his reassurance suddenly feel like a carefully constructed lie? The open loop of his strange behavior left her mind racing, searching for answers she couldn't grasp. "Why after?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Liam, what's going on?" He gave her a tight, forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Trust me," he murmured, before turning his back on her and striding back to the platform. The word, which once had been her anchor, now felt like a stone, pulling her down into the cold, dark depths of a truth she was not yet ready to face. Chapter 3. The Roar of Silence. The moon, full and impossibly bright, crested the tops of the pine trees, bathing the clearing in a light as sharp and white as bleached bone. A collective hush fell over the pack. The time had come. Alpha Marcus, Liam's father, stepped forward, his voice a powerful baritone that rolled over the crowd. He spoke of tradition, of strength, of the sacred duty to continue their bloodlines. Cora's hands grew clammy, her breath catching in her throat. Every word was a hammer blow, building the walls of her prison higher and higher. Liam stepped to the center of the platform, taking the ceremonial microphone. The silver of the mic gleamed under the moonlight. This was it. The moment that would either save her or shatter her completely. He cleared his throat, and the sound echoed in the sudden, profound silence. He looked out at the faces of his pack, his expression unreadable. Not at her. He wouldn't look at her. "My pack," he began, his voice amplified, carrying to the farthest edges of the clearing. "Tonight, we honor the moon goddess. We honor our legacy, and we secure our future." He paused, and in that pause, Cora felt the world tilt on its axis. A pack is only as strong as its alpha, and an alpha is only as strong as his Luna. He finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping over her, cold and impersonal as a winter frost. There was no love there, no recognition, only a chilling, calculated distance. The fragile thread of hope she'd been clinging to snapped. "The bond has chosen for me," he continued, his voice ringing with false regret. "It has chosen Cora." A murmur went through the crowd, not of excitement, but of confusion, of unease. "But I cannot accept it." A gasp rippled through the clearing. Cora felt the blood drain from her face, her ears ringing. No, this wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "I cannot bind my alpha wolf to an empty shell," he declared, his voice rising with conviction, turning his personal betrayal into a public spectacle of righteous duty. The Silver Moon Pack needs a Luna with a soul, a wolf to guide them, not a void. The last word was spat like a curse. And then, the most terrible sound Cora had ever heard began. It started as a low murmur of agreement, then grew. It swelled into a wave of shouts, of stomping feet, of applause. They were cheering. They were cheering her damnation. The noise was a physical force, a blade twisting in her soul. It was the roar of their approval for her erasure. Her vision tunneled. The torches blurred into streaks of fire. The faces of her pack, people she had known her entire life, became a monstrous, jeering mob. She saw Liam choose another girl, a pretty she-wolf named Alara, pulling her onto the platform and kissing her to the wild applause of the pack. The betrayal was absolute, complete. She didn't feel herself turn. She didn't feel her feet move. All she knew was the desperate, primal instinct to run, to flee the roar of the crowd, the sight of her shattered life, the truth of her own emptiness. She ran, stumbling into the deep, forbidden darkness of the woods, the sound of their celebration chasing her like a predator. Chapter 4. A storm of silver tears and terror were a blinding combination. Branches whipped at Cora's face, leaving stinging trails on her skin, but she didn't slow down. The roar of the pack's celebration was a physical beast at her back, snapping at her heels. She just ran. Deeper and deeper into the forbidden woods, a place of old gods and older shadows where pack law held no sway. Every rustle of leaves was a pursuer. Each hoot of an owl was a judgment. Her lungs burned. A fire scorched her throat. She stumbled over a gnarled root, pitching forward into the lightless tangle. Then she hit it. Not a tree. Something else entirely. It was a wall of solid muscle and blistering heat, unmovable and absolute. The impact sent a shockwave through her entire body, knocking the breath from her lungs as she crumpled to the forest floor. A low grunt from above told her it was a man. A very, very large man. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her haze of misery. She had run from her pack only to find a rogue, a monster. She scrambled backward, crab-walking through the damp leaves, her eyes wide as she looked up. And up. He was a silhouette against the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy, a figure carved from granite and fury. He didn't move to help her. He didn't even seem to notice her. He was on one knee, his head bowed, a hand gripping the earth so tightly the dirt and roots groaned. A tremor ran through his massive frame, a silent earthquake of pain. When he finally lifted his head, the breath caught in her throat. His face was all harsh angles and savage beauty, framed by a mane of raven-black hair. But his eyes were impossible. They were the color of molten silver, swirling with an ancient, unbearable storm. They weren't angry. They were something far more terrifying. They were desperate, and they were locked on her. The moment their gazes met, a jolt, sharp and electric, shot through her. It was a searing heat that felt both like a burn and the first touch of warmth she'd felt in her entire life. For him, the reaction was even more profound. The storm in his silver eyes stilled. The tension that had held his body rigid as iron seemed to melt away, replaced by a look of stunned, raw relief. It was the look of a man who had been screaming for 1,000 years and had just, for the very first time, heard silence. He rose to his full, towering height, a predator uncoiling. Every instinct she didn't have screamed at her to run. He took a step toward her, his movements fluid and silent. "What are you?" he breathed. The words not a question but a demand, a sound like stones grinding together deep within the earth. He didn't wait for an answer. He reached out, his fingers grazing her cheek, and the jolt returned, stronger this time. A gasp escaped his lips, a shudder of pure bliss. He looked at her not as a person, but as a miracle, as a possession. "You," he growled. the sound a low, rumbling thunder that vibrated in her bones. You are my cure. And a cure is not something a king ever lets go. Chapter 5. The Citadel of Shadows. The world became a blur of motion and overwhelming presence. He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, his arms iron bands around her. She fought. She kicked and clawed and screamed until her throat was raw, but it was like struggling against a mountain. He simply held her, his long, relentless strides carrying them through the night-shrouded forest. The air grew colder, and the scent of pine gave way to the sharp, clean smell of high-altitude stone. Before she knew it, they were before it, the Citadel. It wasn't a castle from a storybook. It was a fortress, a brutalist masterpiece of black granite that clawed its way up the side of a mountain, seeming to challenge the very stars above. Towers like broken teeth bit at the clouds. No lights shone from its narrow, arrow-slit windows. It felt dead. A tomb for a giant. He carried her across a chasm on a bridge of swaying rope and wood, the wind whistling a mournful song below. She could see strange, twisting symbols carved into the stone of the gate, patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the corner of her eye. What kind of place was this? Inside, the silence was absolute and suffocating. Not the peaceful quiet she sometimes found in her cabin, but a heavy, listening silence, thick with ancient dust and unspoken secrets. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally in the cavernous halls. There were no servants, no courtiers, no life at all. Just endless corridors of cold, dark stone and faded tapestries depicting brutal, bloody battles between wolves the size of horses and things made of shadow and teeth. An unsettling detail pricked at her mind. There were no mirrors. Ornate, empty frames hung on the walls where glass should have been. Why would a king have no desire to see his own reflection? He finally deposited her in a chamber that was both luxurious and terrifying. The bed was massive, draped in furs as black as a starless night. A fireplace stood cold and empty, a gaping maw in the wall. The only window was a tall, narrow slit high up the wall, barred with thick iron. It was a gilded cage, a beautiful prison. He placed her on her feet, but his hands remained on her shoulders, his grip a constant, burning reminder of her captivity. "You will stay here," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will not try to leave." "Who are you?" she finally managed to choke out, her defiance a flickering candle in a hurricane. His silver eyes bored into her, and for the first time, she saw the sheer weight of the crown he wore, an invisible burden that seemed to crush the very air around him. "I am Cain, and you are mine." He turned and left, the heavy wooden door booming shut with a sound of utter finality. A key scraped in the iron lock. She was alone. Alone in a dead fortress, the prisoner of a tormented king who looked at her like she was the only thing holding his world together. She ran to the door, pounding her fists against the unforgiving wood until her knuckles were raw and bleeding, her screams echoing unanswered in the listening dark. Chapter 6. The tyrant's plea days bled into a gray, featureless eternity. Twice a day, a silent, grim-faced guard would leave a tray of food outside her door, never speaking, never making eye contact. The isolation was a slow poison, seeping into her bones. She paced the length of her chamber, a caged animal, memorizing every crack in the stone, every thread in the morbid tapestries. She tested the window bars, a fool's errand. They were immovable. She was well and truly trapped, a bird in a stone cage. He came to her only at night. She would be huddled on the massive bed, feigning sleep, and she would feel his presence before she heard the lock turn. The very air in the room would grow heavy, charged with his power and his pain. He wouldn't light a candle. He would simply move to the large, ornate chair in the darkest corner of the room and sit and watch her. Tonight was no different. The door opened with a low groan, and his immense shadow fell across the floor. He moved with a predator's grace to his usual spot. The silence stretched, thick and unnerving. She could hear his breathing, a low, steady rhythm that was a stark contrast to the frantic hammering of her own heart. "I know you're awake," His voice rumbled from the darkness, startling her. Cora sat up, pulling the furs tightly around her shoulders as a shield. "What do you want from me?" "I want," he began, then paused, as if the words were foreign, difficult to form. "I want you to stay." "I'm your prisoner," she shot back, her voice sharp with bitterness. "I don't have a choice." A long silence. Then, "No, you don't." His honesty was more chilling than any lie. "This peace you bring, it is a thing I have not known since I was a boy. Before the all bond took hold, before the crown." There it was again. A hint of the mystery, a piece of the puzzle she couldn't solve. What was the all bond? What had happened to him? The questions burned on her tongue, but she swallowed them. Showing interest was a weakness. Showing empathy was a death sentence. "So I'm just a thing to you? A tool? A walking, breathing bottle of medicine?" He rose from the chair, a mountain of shadow detaching itself from the greater darkness. He crossed the room in 2 strides, looming over her bed. The sheer intensity of his presence made her want to shrink away, to disappear into the mattress. His silver eyes seemed to glow, a swirling vortex of agony and something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like reverence. "You are no tool," he whispered, his voice raw, stripped of its kingly authority. It was the voice of a man on the brink. "You are the only thing that is real. Everything else is just noise." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face, his knuckles white with restraint. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The air crackled with a power that made the hair on her arms stand on end. He was a tyrant, a monster, her captor. So why did the sight of his profound, unbearable suffering make a traitorous part of her want to reach out and soothe it? Chapter 7. A Court of Whispers. After that night, a subtle shift occurred. The door to her chamber was no longer locked. 2 guards, silent sentinels carved from shadow and granite, now stood posted outside, their presence both a promise of protection and a reminder of her inescapable status. Cain had granted her a longer leash. Not freedom, but a carefully curated illusion of it. She was permitted to walk the echoing halls of the upper citadel, to explore its vast, dust-choked library and its windswept battlements. He needed her closer. The further she was, the louder the noise in his head became. A fact she was beginning to understand was the unspoken law of this entire, desolate kingdom. The citadel was a place of profound loneliness. Every surface was cold to the touch, every footstep an intrusion. The empty mirror frames continued to unnerve her, a constant suggestion that this place and its king could not bear to look at themselves. It was in the library, a circular chamber where books climbed the walls like ivy, that she finally met someone else. An unexpected bloom in a garden of stone. The voice was smooth as polished river rock, startling her. A man stepped out from between 2 towering shelves, a stark contrast to Cain's raw, elemental presence. He was handsome in a severe, clean-shaven way, his dark hair streaked with distinguished silver at the temples. He wore the fine, tailored tunic of a high-ranking courtier, and his smile was a masterpiece of polite, unreadable charm. "Forgive my intrusion," he said with a slight bow. "I am Marcus, the king's advisor. And you, I presume, are the guest who has captured his undivided attention." Cora's guard went up instantly. The word guest was a silken lie. "I'm Cora." Indeed. Marcus's eyes, a shrewd, intelligent brown, raked over her, missing nothing. "It has been a long time since these halls have seen new life. The king, he does not entertain visitors. His affliction makes it difficult." The advisor's tone was sympathetic, but a flicker of something cold and calculating in his gaze set her teeth on edge. This man was a predator of a different sort, one who hunted with words instead of claws. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You must understand, the king's desperation can make him seem tyrannical. The all bond is a terrible burden, a curse that has shattered better men than he. A man drowning in an ocean of noise will cling to any silence, no matter the cost to the silence itself. Be careful, little bird. Cages, even gilded ones, have a way of crushing the wings of those within. With another thin smile, he was gone, melting back into the shadows of the library. His words lingered in the air, a subtle poison. He had seemed to offer a warning, an act of kindness. But Cora felt it for what it was, a perfectly aimed dart, designed to sow fear and suspicion. He had confirmed Kane's desperation while painting it as a dangerous weakness. He had called her a bird in a cage, reinforcing her own worst fears. Marcus was not her ally. He was playing a game she didn't yet understand, a game of whispers and shadows where she was an unwelcome, unpredictable piece on the board. Chapter 8. The Weight of a Crown. The storm she had only glimpsed in Kane's eyes finally broke. It happened without warning. She was in her chamber when a sound, a terrible, agonized sound of splintering wood and a guttural roar of pain, shook the very foundations of the citadel. The guards outside her door stiffened, their hands flying to the hilts of their swords, but they did not move from their posts. They had heard this before. This was a familiar tempest. Driven by a morbid, terrified curiosity, Cora slipped out of her room and followed the sound down the corridor to the king's study. The heavy oak doors were slightly ajar. Peeking through the crack, her heart seized in her chest. The room was a disaster zone. A massive table was overturned, scrolls and maps scattered like fallen leaves. A chair had been smashed to splinters against a stone wall, and in the center of the chaos was Kane. He was on his knees, his massive body racked with tremors. His hands were pressed to his temples, his knuckles white, as if he were trying to physically contain the explosion happening inside his own skull. A low, continuous moan of pure agony escaped his lips, a sound so raw and broken it bypassed her fear and struck something deep inside her. This wasn't the tyrant. This wasn't the monster. This was a man being tortured from the inside out. The curse, the all bond. It was a symphony of screaming glass in his head, and he was shattering with it. For a long moment, she just watched, frozen. Her mind screamed at her to run, to lock her door, to hide from this terrifying display of raw, uncontrolled power and pain. This had nothing to do with her. He was her captor. His suffering was not her problem. But then he let out another choked cry, and through their strange, budding connection, she felt an echo of it, a phantom spike of pain behind her own eyes, a fleeting whisper of 1,000 voices screaming at once. It was unbearable, and he lived with the full force of it every single day. Before she even knew what she was doing, her feet were moving. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. He didn't seem to notice her, lost in his private hell. She approached him slowly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. What was she doing? Was she insane? She knelt in front of him amidst the wreckage of his study. "Kane?" she whispered. He flinched, his head snapping up. His silver eyes were wild, unfocused, the pupils blown wide with agony. He looked straight through her. He was drowning. The warning from Marcus echoed in her head. A drowning man will cling to any silence. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. This was madness. He could snap her in two without a thought. But the sight of his torment, it was a thing she could not turn away from. Hesitantly, she placed her palm against his forehead. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A violent shudder racked his body. A deep, ragged gasp tore from his lungs. The storm in his eyes didn't just still. It vanished, replaced by a look of such profound, exhausted gratitude that it stole her breath. The silence she brought him was a balm, a cool hand on a fevered soul. And as her skin touched his, she felt something new. A flash. An image in her own mind, not hers. A battlefield under a blood-red moon. The smell of death. The sound of a woman screaming a name. Camilla. Chapter 9. Ghosts of the Past. The arrival of the delegation was announced by a horn blast that echoed strangely against the citadel's silent stones. Cora was on a battlement, watching a pair of eagles ride the thermal winds, when she heard it. A cold knot of premonition tightened in her gut. Visitors were not a part of this world. Visitors meant the outside was intruding on her strange, isolated reality. Kane found her there, his face a mask of controlled neutrality, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, a low hum of irritation. "Your former alpha is here," he said, his voice flat. "He has requested an audience." The ground seemed to fall away beneath her feet. Liam. Here. The thought was so absurd, so horrifying, that for a moment she couldn't breathe. "Why?" "He claims you are a runaway member of his pack, that you belong to them." Kane's silver eyes darkened, the calm she had brought him just a day ago already disturbed. "He is mistaken." They met in the Citadel's great hall, a cavernous space where their footsteps were the only sound. Liam stood before the empty throne, flanked by two of his largest warriors. He looked smaller here, diminished by the sheer scale of the hall and the oppressive weight of its ancient power. He tried to project the same arrogant confidence he'd worn at the ceremony, but a nervous tremor in his hands gave him away. When his eyes landed on Cora, standing beside Kane, he flinched. "Alpha King," Liam began, his voice trying for respectful and landing on strained. "I am here to reclaim what is mine. Cora is a member of the Silver Moon Pack. Her place is with us." Cora's knuckles were white where she gripped her own hands. The humiliation, the shame of that night, came rushing back, a bitter tide of bile in her throat. Kane was silent for a long moment, his stillness more intimidating than any roar. "She has no place with you," he stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You made that quite clear when you cast her out. You named her a flaw, an empty shell. You do not get to discard a treasure and then return, demanding it back simply because you have learned it has value to another." Liam's face flushed with anger. "She is a void, a wolfless anomaly. What possible value could she have to you?" That was the wrong thing to say. A wave of pure, untamed power rolled off Kane, so potent it made the air crackle. The torches in their sconces flared wildly, casting dancing, demonic shadows. Liam and his warriors staggered back, their pack bravado evaporating in the face of true primal authority. A low, terrifying growl started deep in Kane's chest, the sound of a landslide, of mountains breaking. "You are not worthy to speak her name." Kane's voice was no longer a rumble. It was a roar that shook the very stones of the hall. He moved, a blur of speed, and was suddenly in front of Liam. His hand clamped around the younger alpha's throat, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. Liam choked, his face turning a shade of purple, his feet kicking uselessly. "You had a goddess in your midst and you were too blind and stupid to see it. You looked at a miracle and called it a curse." He held Liam there for another terrifying second before flinging him to the floor like a broken doll. Kane stood over him, a figure of absolute, terrifying judgment. He looked at Cora, and his eyes, blazing with silver fire, held a raw, possessive fury that was entirely on her behalf. It wasn't about her ability. It wasn't about the silence. This was for her. He was protecting her. "She is under my protection now," Kane snarled, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that carried more weight than his roar. "She belongs here, with me. Now get out of my sight before I forget the ancient laws of hospitality and hang your hides from my battlements." Chapter 10. Echoes in the Quiet. In the wake of Liam's humiliating departure, the Citadel's oppressive silence felt different. It was no longer just empty. It was charged, thrumming with the aftershock of Kane's terrifying power. Cora retreated to the library, the scent of old paper and leather a familiar comfort, but she couldn't settle. His words echoed in her mind. You had a goddess in your midst. He hadn't been defending a cure. He had been defending her. The thought was a dangerous, fragile seed of warmth in the frozen soil of her heart. For the first time, She wondered if he saw past the void, past her utility, to the girl drowning inside. She was tracing the faded gold leaf on the spine of a forgotten history book when it happened. A wave of emotion so vast and desolate it almost buckled her knees, washed over her. It was not her own. It was a profound, soul-deep loneliness, cold and sharp as the granite of the citadel itself. It tasted of solitude and the crushing weight of a crown worn for too long. With a certainty that defied logic, she knew it was his. Cain. Sitting on his throne in the great hall, surrounded by the ghosts of his ancestors, feeling utterly and completely alone. The unsolicited intimacy was a violation, a psychic intrusion that left her feeling exposed and breathless. The connection between them was evolving, growing stronger, a vine with thorns wrapping itself around her mind. Had he felt it too? Had he felt the flare of her old shame when Liam stood before her, or the confusing spark of gratitude when he had defended her? This wasn't just about her presence soothing him anymore. This was a two-way street, a raw, unfiltered conduit of emotion flowing between them, and she had no idea how to close the door. This realization sparked a new kind of fear. It was one thing to be a prisoner in his castle. It was another to be a prisoner in his mind. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let him consume what little was left of her. Her resolve hardened. She had to know what was happening. She had to confront him. This shared silence, once a simple fact of her captivity, was becoming a shared consciousness, and that was a line she would not let him cross. She found him in the armory, the air thick with the metallic tang of polished steel and old oil. He was sharpening a massive broadsword, the rhythmic scrape of the whetstone the only sound. He didn't look up as she entered, but she knew he felt her. The tension in his shoulders eased almost imperceptibly. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We are talking," he rumbled, his eyes fixed on the gleaming edge of the blade. "No, I mean, what is this? This feeling?" She struggled for the words. "Earlier, in the library, I felt you." His hands stilled. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint drip of water somewhere in the stone fortress. He finally lifted his silver eyes to meet hers, and she saw a flicker of something she had never seen there before. Surprise, and a deep, weary resignation. "The bond," he said, his voice low. "It grows stronger. It is bleeding through." Bleeding. The word was perfect. It felt exactly like that, an emotional wound that refused to close. "Make it stop," she demanded. He set the sword down with a soft clang that echoed like a death knell. "I cannot," he admitted, and in that simple admission, she saw the true nature of his prison. He wasn't just a king burdened by a curse. He was a passenger in the storm of his own power. "I do not control it any more than you do." That was the moment she understood. He was just as trapped as she was. Chapter 11. A gilded cage is still a cage. The knowledge that Cain was as much a victim of their bond as she was did not bring comfort. It brought a chilling, terrifying clarity. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't let her go. This connection, this emotional bleeding would only deepen until there was no line between his soul and hers. The seed of warmth she had felt after he defended her withered, replaced by the cold, hard certainty that a gilded cage is still a cage. His protection was a prison. His need was a chain. She would not be consumed. She would not trade one form of erasure for another. She had to leave. The decision settled not with a bang, but with a quiet, steely resolve. Her goal was no longer just to survive his moods or understand his mystery. Her purpose was singular. Freedom, true freedom, on her own terms. She began to watch, to learn. She had been a prisoner, but now she would be a spy in her own life. She memorized the guards' patrol patterns, the 2 silent sentinels who flanked her door. They changed shifts at the 4th hour after moonrise, a brief moment of transition where one guard would leave his post just before the other arrived. A window. barely a minute long. She learned the rhythms of the citadel, the clang of the cookpots from the distant kitchens, the howl of the wind through the battlements that could cover the sound of a footstep. She became a ghost in the halls, her defiance turning from outward confrontation to inward meticulous planning. He was the biggest obstacle. His need for her proximity was a constant anchor. She realized she couldn't just run. She had to make him believe she had accepted her fate. So she softened. She stopped arguing, offering quiet companionship instead. She would sit with him in the library, the silence between them no longer a battleground, but a feigned truce. She could feel his surprise through the bond, his cautious, disbelieving relief. It felt like a betrayal, using his pain against him. But what choice did she have? It was his cage or her soul. She chose her soul. The night of the new moon, when the darkness was at its deepest, she was ready. She had saved a piece of bread and cheese from her dinner tray, a pathetic provision for a desperate journey. She wore the dark, simple clothes she had arrived in. Her heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. This was it. One chance. She waited, listening to the slow, heavy footsteps of the guard pacing outside her door. She counted his passes. 10, 11, 12. He stopped. A moment of silence. Then, the sound of his footsteps receding down the hall. Now. She slipped out of her room, a shadow moving through shadows. The corridor was empty. Her bare feet were silent on the cold stone. She moved past the empty mirror frames, past the grim tapestries of war. She didn't look back. Down a winding servant's staircase she had discovered behind a loose stone. Past the sleeping kitchens, the air thick with the smell of cold ashes and yeast. She made it to a small iron-banded postern gate, one she had noticed was used for supplies. The bar was heavy. She put her shoulder into it, gritting her teeth, praying to a goddess she no longer believed in. It groaned, a hideous, screeching sound in the dead quiet of the night. She froze, listening. Nothing. With a final, desperate heave, the bar lifted. She slipped through the opening, out into the biting, shockingly cold night air. She was out. A wild, dizzying wave of exhilaration washed over her. She took a breath, the first breath of true freedom she had taken in weeks. And from the highest tower of the citadel behind her, a single mournful alarm bell began to toll. Chapter 12. The hunt and the hunter freedom tasted like pine needles and panic. Cora plunged into the forest, the frantic ringing of the alarm bell chasing her, a promise of the fury she had unleashed. The darkness that had been her ally was now her enemy, filled with grasping roots and unseen drops. She ran blindly, fueled by adrenaline and the terrifying, exhilarating reality of what she had done. She was free, but she was also being hunted. The bond, once a creeping vine, was now a jagged chain yanking at her soul. It was no longer a gentle bleed of emotion. It was psychic shrapnel, a wave of pure, incandescent rage, not her own, slammed into her, so powerful it made her stumble. It was Cain. He knew. The fury was a white-hot fire, a promise of retribution that scorched her from the inside out. This was the king, the tyrant, the beast she had first seen, not the wounded man who sat in her room at night. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the branches that tore at her clothes and skin. She had to get further away. The rage was followed by a new sensation, something deeper and more terrifying. A vast, hollowing desperation. It was the feeling of a man whose only anchor in a lifelong storm had just been ripped away. It was a feeling of drowning, and it was so potent, so absolute, that it stole her breath, her own lungs suddenly feeling tight and empty. He wasn't just angry she was gone, he was breaking. Could he track her through this? This raw, open wound between their minds? The thought was a new, chilling horror. He wouldn't just be hunting her scent. He would be following the trail of her own fear, a psychic beacon in the night. The hunter and the hunted, bound by an invisible leash. What had she done? Had she traded a gilded cage for an open-air prison with a warden who lived inside her own head? Panic began to claw at the edges of her resolve. She couldn't just run. Running was pointless if he could feel her every move. She needed to be smarter. She needed answers. Real answers. Not the cryptic warnings of an advisor or the pained admissions of a king. She needed to understand what she was, what he was, what this bond between them truly meant. The seer. The rumor she had heard in the human town weeks ago about an old woman who lived deep in the neutral mountains, a woman who knew the old ways, the forgotten magic. It was a fool's hope, a whispered legend. But it was the only hope she had. She had to find her. She had to learn how to sever this chain, or at the very least, how to shield herself from the storm of the man who was, at this very moment, hunting her with the furious, desperate, and broken pieces of his own soul. Chapter 13. A Web of Whispers. The journey to the seer had stripped away the last of Cora's naivety, replacing it with a truth so heavy it felt like a shroud. She was not a flaw. She was a weapon, a sacred vessel, a living shield. The knowledge was a terrifying, empowering burden. After leaving the seer's mountain sanctuary, she had not run blindly, but had moved with purpose, melting into the chaotic tapestry of a grimy border town called Sorrow's End. It was a place of gray skies and grayer morals, a haven for outcasts, deserters, and those who wished to disappear. It was perfect. Here, she was just another face in the crowd. She took a room above a noisy tavern, the smell of stale ale and wood smoke a constant presence. Her days were spent listening. The town was a nexus of gossip, a place where the whispers from a dozen different packs converged. She learned that Cain's sudden, obsessive hunt for a wolfless girl had sent shockwaves through the territories. Some alphas saw it as a sign of his curse finally driving him to madness. Others, the more cunning ones, saw it as a sign of a new, unknown power entering the game. She heard Marcus's name spoken in hushed, reverent tones by shifters who did not bear Cain's sigil. They spoke of a new order, of a return to the old ways, of a king who was growing soft, influenced by a strange witch. She was the witch. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of her own story, piecing together the conspiracy from scattered, venomous whispers. The seer's warning echoed in her mind. A curse must be contained by a love that is absolute. The thought of love was a bitter pill. How could she love her captor? The man whose roiling emotions still bled into her own mind, a constant, faint echo of his rage and desperation. Yet, the memory of his raw defense of her in the great hall, the image of his unbearable suffering in the study, it was a confusing, dangerous counterpoint. She was buying a loaf of stale bread in the muddy market, her hood pulled low, when a scent cut through the miasma of the town. It was a smell of pine and clean earth, the scent of her home pack, of him. Her heart leaped into her throat. She spun around, her eyes scanning the crowd, expecting to see the glint of silver eyes, the towering form of the king. Instead, she saw a familiar, handsome face that made the blood in her veins turn to ice. Liam. He wasn't dressed as an alpha heir, but in the simple leather tunic of a traveling wolf. He looked weary, haunted, and when his eyes finally found hers, they were not filled with the arrogance she remembered, but with a look of profound, gut-wrenching remorse. He took a hesitant step toward her, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Cora. He breathed her name, and the sound of it on his lips was the ghost of a promise she had once believed in. I've been looking for you everywhere. Her first instinct was to run, but where could she go? And a more dangerous, insidious thought followed. He was her past. A past she had never gotten to confront, only flee. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the chance to finally get an answer, to finally ask him the question that had festered in her soul since that terrible night. Why? Chapter 14. The Serpent's Remorse. He led her away from the crowded market to a quiet, secluded corner of the town, near the crumbling remains of an old stone wall. The air was damp and cool. Cora kept her distance, her body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt. The emotional echoes from Kane felt distant here, a faint, static hum beneath the surface of her own turbulent feelings. "What do you want, Liam?" she asked, her voice hard, betraying none of the chaos inside her. He had the grace to look ashamed. He wouldn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on a loose stone at his feet. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice quiet, strained. "What I did, it was unforgivable. I know that. But you have to understand. My father, the pack elders, they pressured me. They said binding myself to a void would be a death sentence for our pack, that it would show weakness." He finally looked up, and his blue eyes were filled with a convincing, watery sheen of regret. "I was a coward, Cora. I was so scared of losing my position, of failing my father, that I failed you. I broke my promise, and I have lived with that shame every single day since." Every word was a perfectly aimed arrow striking the most wounded, vulnerable parts of her. He wasn't making excuses. He was confessing his weakness. He was validating the truth she had always suspected, that it wasn't her, not really, but the cruel politics of their world. It was a seductive, dangerous balm on a festering wound. "Why are you here?" she pressed, refusing to let her guard down completely. "Why now?" "Because I was wrong," he said, taking a step closer. She didn't move away. "When the Alpha King started hunting you, my father and the others saw it too. They realized you weren't a weakness. You're a power, something he wants. They sent me to bring you back, to force you back." He shook his head, a look of self-disgust on his face. "But I couldn't do it. I can't be their tool anymore. I'm here for you, Cora, to help you, to offer you a way home, a real home this time. We can stand against my father together. I can make it right. I swear it." The plea was a masterpiece. It offered her everything she had ever wanted: an apology, validation, a chance to reclaim her place, and the power to do it on her own terms. It was a serpent's promise, sweet and intoxicating. The logical part of her brain screamed that it was a trap. But the broken girl inside, the girl who had been called an empty shell, desperately wanted to believe that the man who had shattered her was trying to piece her back together. Her internal struggle was a silent war. Trusting him was insane. But what was the alternative? A life on the run, haunted by the psychic ghost of a tormented king. "How?" she asked, the single word a concession, a crack in her armor. A relieved, triumphant light flared in his eyes, gone so quickly she almost missed it. "I have allies, people who are tired of the old ways. They can give us safe passage back, help us build our own power base. You have to trust me one more time." The serpent had offered the apple, and with a sense of fatalistic dread, she reached out and took a bite. Chapter 15. The Closing of the Trap. Trusting Liam felt like swallowing glass. The first few days of their journey were a tense, cautious dance. He was deferential, kind, treating her not as a flaw but as a revered, long-lost partner. He told her stories of their childhood, reminding her of the bond they once shared, skillfully weaving a tapestry of nostalgia designed to lull her into a false sense of security. They traveled through dense, unfamiliar forests, avoiding the main pathways. Liam claimed it was for their safety, to avoid both Kane's trackers and his father's patrols. But with each passing mile, the landscape grew colder, the trees more gnarled and skeletal, the air heavier with a sense of foreboding. The emotional hum from Kane was growing stronger again, a low, anxious thrum that spoke of a hunt growing ever closer. It was a constant, unnerving reminder of the cage she had fled, making Liam's promise of freedom all the more appealing. They met his allies at a crossroads marked by a trio of withered oak trees. They were a grim, silent group of warriors, their armor bearing a sigil she didn't recognize, a coiled serpent biting its own tail. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather snaked down her spine. These weren't freedom fighters. They were soldiers, hardened and cold. Their eyes weren't filled with hope for a new way. They were filled with the flat, merciless obedience of men who followed orders without question. Liam's demeanor shifted the moment they were under the warrior's escort. The remorseful, gentle man disappeared, replaced by the familiar arrogance of the alpha heir. He was no longer trying to convince her, he was commanding her. The trap, which had been so carefully baited, now began to close its iron jaws around her. Her blood ran cold with a dawning, sickening horror. She hadn't been rescued. She had been recaptured. The final leg of their journey was a forced march. All pretense was gone. She was a prisoner once more. She thought of Cain, of the raw honesty of his torment, and contrasted it with the slick, insidious nature of Liam's lies. She had fled a monster she was beginning to understand, only to run into the arms of a serpent she had foolishly trusted. They arrived at a fortified encampment, deep in a mountain pass as dusk was bleeding across the sky, and standing there, waiting for them, his arms crossed over his chest, a thin, triumphant smile on his lips, was Marcus, the king's advisor, the man who had warned her about gilded cages. He looked from Liam to Cora, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a master strategist whose gambit had paid off perfectly. "Alpha Liam," Marcus said, his voice smooth as venom. "Well done. You have delivered the package, as promised." He then turned his chilling gaze to Cora. "Welcome, little bird. I'm afraid your flight is over. The Equinox Summit begins tomorrow, and you are the guest of honor." The trap hadn't just closed. It had been part of a much larger, more terrifying plan from the very beginning. Chapter 16. The Summit of Vipers. The Equinox Summit was held in a cavernous mountain hall, a neutral ground where the territories converged. The air was thick with the combined aura of nearly 100 alphas, a crushing weight of power, ambition, and ancient rivalries. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and Cora felt like she had been shoved into the center of it, drenched in oil. Flanked by Marcus's silent guards, she was escorted to a position near the front, a place of honor that felt more like a sacrificial altar. Every eye in the hall was on her. She saw suspicion, contempt, and in some, a predatory curiosity. She was the king's rumored weakness, the wolfless witch, and they were all here to see if the rumors were true. Then she saw him. Cain stood on a raised dais across the hall, a lone figure of formidable power. But she could see the cracks in his granite facade. His silver eyes were shot through with exhaustion, the skin stretched taut over his cheekbones. The psychic pressure of so many alphas in one place was clearly a unique and exquisite form of torture for him. The constant roar had become a physical assault. Their eyes met across the cavern, and the bond, which had been a low hum of anxiety since her capture, flared to life. She felt a jolt of his pure, undiluted shock at seeing her there, standing beside his most trusted advisor. The shock was immediately followed by a wave of cold, murderous rage, so potent it made her own blood run cold. And beneath it all, a current of heart-shattering despair. You walked into their trap. Marcus stepped forward, his voice smooth and commanding, silencing the low murmur of the assembled alphas. "Brothers, sisters, we gather tonight to address a sickness that has befallen our kingdom, a shadow that has fallen over our king." He gestured dramatically toward Cora. "For weeks our king has been distracted, unwell. He has neglected his duties, abandoned his court, all in obsessive pursuit of this woman." His words were honey-tongued, yet dripped with venom. A woman with no wolf, no pack, no history, a void, who appeared from nowhere and has held our powerful king in her sway. I ask you, what is this if not a dark and insidious witchcraft? A low growl of agreement rumbled through the hall. They were a pack of wolves, and they had smelled blood in the water. Cora stood frozen, a living effigy for their fear and suspicion. She could feel Cain's fury building, a volcano preparing to erupt. He opened his mouth to speak, to unleash the hell she had seen him unleash on Liam, but Marcus was too quick. "Do not be so quick to defend her, my king," the advisor said, his voice laced with false sympathy. "For we have a witness, one who knows the truth of her manipulative nature, one who was her first intended victim." Marcus turned, and from the crowd, a figure emerged, stepping into the torchlight with a practiced air of solemn reluctance. It was Liam. Chapter 17. The Betrayal's Echo. Liam's face was a mask of tragic, noble sincerity. He looked not at Cora, but at the assembled alphas, his audience. He looked like a man about to confess a terrible burden. The silence in the hall was absolute, a held breath of anticipation. Cora's own lungs felt frozen. This was it. The final closing wall of the trap. "I am Liam, heir to the Silver Moon Pack," he began, his voice ringing with a strength she knew he didn't possess. "And I know this woman, she was my fated mate." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was a new, shocking piece of the puzzle. This wasn't just some random witch. She was a mate-bound outcast. "I felt the pull," Liam continued, pressing a hand to his heart in a gesture of pained honesty. "But my wolf, my very soul, recoiled from her. It sensed the emptiness within, the void. When I refused the bond for the good of my pack, she did not accept it. She swore she would find a greater power to ensnare. She told me she would find a wolf so strong his power would fill her emptiness and make her a queen." He was twisting her pain into a narrative of petty, power-hungry ambition. He was taking her deepest wound and presenting it to the world as a weapon she had tried to use. "She is a parasite," Liam declared, his voice rising, gaining confidence as he felt the crowd turning in his favor. "One who seeks to latch onto the strongest host she can find. She failed with me, so she set her sights on a king." It was a masterful, devastating lie. It took every truth, her rejection, her pain, her connection to Cain, and warped it into something monstrous. She looked at the faces of the alphas. She saw no mercy there, only the cold, hard glint of belief. They were predators, and Liam had just given them a reason to tear her apart. Her past and present had conspired to create a monster, and she was wearing its face. "Thank you, brave heir," Marcus said, placing a hand on Liam's shoulder. "For speaking a truth our king is too bewitched to see." He then turned his attention back to Cain, whose face was a thundercloud of disbelief and incandescent rage. "You see, my king? She is not a cure. She is the disease. A poison that weakens the crown for her own gain." Marcus reached into his tunic and produced a small dark object. It was a shard of obsidian, pulsing with a faint, sickly purple light and covered in the same writhing symbols she had seen on the gates of the citadel. A cursed object. An amplifier. "Sometimes," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a somber, regretful tone, "the only way to cure a fever is to burn it out completely." He was going to use it on Cain. He was going to use the king's own curse as the weapon of his undoing, and he had made her the reason for it all. Chapter 18. The King in Chains. Before Cain could react, before he could unleash the cataclysm of power building behind his eyes, Marcus lifted the obsidian shard. "For the good of the kingdom," he shouted, and the artifact flared with a violent, malevolent light. A wave of pure, agonizing energy shot across the hall and slammed into Cain. He didn't just cry out, he roared. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, the sound of a soul being torn apart. He staggered back, his hands flying to his head, the veins on his neck and temples bulging. The psychic noise, the burden he carried every day, was amplified 1,000 times over. It was no longer a storm. It was a supernova of psychic torment, and he was at its epicenter. He collapsed. The mighty Alpha King, the most powerful wolf on the continent, crashed to his knees, his body convulsing, his silver eyes rolling back in his head. A choked, inhuman sound of pain was ripped from his throat. He was completely, utterly incapacitated, a king in invisible chains. The hall was frozen in a moment of shocked silence. Then chaos erupted. But it was a controlled chaos, directed by Marcus. "You see?" the advisor bellowed, pointing at Cora. "The witch's hold is broken! Seize her!" His personal guards, the ones with the serpent sigil, moved instantly. They formed a ring around her, their spears leveled, their faces grim and merciless. She was surrounded. There was nowhere to run. She looked at Cain, broken and writhing on the floor. The man who had been her captor, her protector, her confusing, terrifying anchor in this new world, was defeated. She looked at Liam, his face alight with smug, triumphant victory. The boy who had been her first hope was her final betrayer. She looked out at the sea of powerful, hostile faces and saw only judgment. Her deepest, most secret fear, the one she had carried since she was a child, had finally come true. She wasn't just a flaw. She was a curse. Her very existence brought pain and destruction to those around her. This was it. Her lowest point. All hope was extinguished. The seer's words about her power, about her sacred duty, felt like a cruel joke. What power? She was a helpless girl, surrounded by enemies, the cause of a good man's suffering. The goal was no longer freedom or understanding. The goal was just to breathe through the next second. The weight of her own perceived damnation pressed down on her, silent and absolute. All was lost. Chapter 19. A spark in the void. Despair was a bottomless, silent ocean. Cora stood in the eye of the storm, the jeers and accusations of the alphas a distant, meaningless roar. All she could see was Cain. Broken on the cold stone floor, a king brought low not by a sword, but by the very magic that defined him. They called her a curse. They said she was the cause of this, and in the crushing darkness of that moment, she almost believed them. She was a void, a nothing, and her nothingness had somehow poisoned everything it touched. The shame was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs, threatening to extinguish the last, flickering ember of her spirit. Her gaze drifted to the obsidian shard in Marcus's hand, still pulsing with a faint, malevolent energy. It was a thing of pure malice, designed to amplify pain, to turn a burden into an executioner's axe. And Cain's curse. It was a storm of 1,000 screaming souls, a torment she had only barely touched through the bond. He had lived with that. He had ruled and fought and held a kingdom together while being torn apart from the inside every single day. And the only moments of peace he had ever known were with her. A memory surfaced, the seer's words spoken in a voice that smelled of wood smoke and prophecy. You were not born empty. You were born with room enough to hold a king's soul. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a cruel irony. It was a purpose. The thought was not a shout. It was a whisper in the deepest, most silent part of her. She was not the source of his pain. She was the only one in the world built to contain it. They had called her a flaw, a glitch, an empty shell. But they were all wrong. A shield is not defined by what it is, but by what it can endure. Her deepest fear had been that she was a curse. But her true crucible, her dark night of the soul, was realizing that her greatest terror was not embracing that lie, but failing to live up to the truth of her power. To stand by and do nothing. To let him break because she was too afraid to be what she was born to be. The ember of her spirit did not just flicker, it ignited. She closed her eyes, shutting out the ring of spears, the triumphant sneer on Marcus's face, the hostile stares of the alphas. She shut out the world and turned inward, to the strange invisible chain that bound her to the man on the floor. For weeks she had fought it, resisted it, seen it as a symbol of her captivity. Now, she reached for it, not with her hands, but with her will. With every ounce of her focus, she stopped pushing him away and started pulling him in. It was a silent, desperate plea sent down the psychic conduit between them. Don't break. I'm here. Let me in. Chapter 20. The detonation of the bond. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the cold, heavy silence of her own inner void and the distant echo of Cain's agony. She poured more of herself into the bond, a desperate, reckless act of faith. She didn't just knock on the door to his soul. She threw herself against it, demanding entry. "You are not alone in the storm," she sent, the thought a raw, silent scream. "Let me be your anchor." And then, he answered. From the depths of his pain-ridden consciousness, she felt a flicker of recognition, a spark of his will reaching back for hers. He was still fighting. He had not given up. He had just been waiting for a light in the endless, screaming dark. He latched onto her presence, his psychic grip as desperate and absolute as his physical one had been in the forest. He held on, and she held on, and in that moment of mutual, desperate connection, they chose. Together. The mate bond didn't just click into place, it detonated. A shockwave of pure, untamed power erupted from them both, a silent explosion that threw the nearest guards from their feet. A visible shimmer distorted the air around them, like heat rising from a fire. Cora cried out, her head thrown back, as the full, unrestrained force of Cain's essence flooded her. It was not a gentle stream. It was a tidal wave of ancient power, of royal blood, of the collective might of 1,000 ancestors. It poured into her void, and her emptiness did not just accept it. It consumed it, channeled it, gave it shape and purpose. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating moment of her life. She was no longer an empty shell. She was a crucible, filled with the fire of a king. Through her, the amplified energy of the curse found a new path. Instead of tearing Cain apart, it flowed into her, and her void nature absorbed its malicious intent, stripping it of its power to cause pain and leaving only the raw, unadulterated energy behind. Cain roared, but this time it was not a sound of agony. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated power unleashed. He surged to his feet, his body crackling with energy, the tremors of pain replaced by a deadly, focused calm. The storm in his silver eyes was gone, replaced by a clear, sharp, brilliant light. For the first time, he was free. He looked at her, and the connection between them was no longer a faulty, bleeding link. It was a perfect, seamless bridge. She saw herself in his eyes, and he saw himself in hers. She felt his strength as her own, and he felt her resolve as his. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need a plan. They were two halves of a single, devastating whole. The noise and the silence, finally in balance. And they had just become the most dangerous thing in the room. Chapter 21. Two halves of a whole. The hall was in chaos. Alphas scrambled to their feet, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. Marcus stared, his confident smirk finally shattering, his eyes wide with disbelief at the impossibility unfolding before him. He had planned for a broken king and a dead witch. He had not planned for a god and goddess to rise from the ashes of his treachery. "Kill them!" Marcus shrieked, his voice thin and shrill with panic. "Kill them both!" His serpent-sigiled guards, loyal to the last, charged forward, a wall of steel and snarling fury. Cain moved, but Cora moved with him. It was a dance of perfect, lethal synchronicity. He lunged to the left, his hands becoming claws that ripped through a guard's shield, and she instinctively sidestepped to the right, her focus on a different target. She didn't have claws or fangs, but she had something new, something only she could do. She focused on a charging warrior, and with a thought she pushed her power outward. Not with force, but with absence. She created a zone of absolute magical silence around him. The warrior's inner wolf, the source of his supernatural speed and strength, was suddenly gone. He stumbled, his powerful lunge becoming a clumsy human trip. He looked down at his hands, his face a mask of confusion and terror, a shifter suddenly and inexplicably cut off from his own soul. Cain, without needing to look, spun and finished the disoriented guard with a single brutal blow. It was intoxicating. She was the anchor, and he was the storm. She could see the battlefield through his eyes, feel the position of every enemy before they moved. She would target an alpha, wrapping them in her nullifying void, and Cain would sweep in, his power now focused and precise, no longer a raging inferno, but a controlled surgical blade. They moved through the guards not back to back, but as a single flowing entity, a whirlwind of silver-eyed fury and profound, unnerving silence. The other alphas, the ones not allied with Marcus, stood frozen, watching the slaughter with a dawning sense of reverence and terror. They were witnessing the birth of a new kind of power, a bond so perfect it defied all known laws of their world. Cora felt a surge of pure, wild joy. This was who she was. Not a flaw, not a mistake. She was the balance to his power, the silence to his storm. Every lie that had ever been told about her burned away in the crucible of this battle, leaving only the pure, undeniable truth of her purpose. She was not his cure. She was his other half. They cut a path through the chaos, their eyes fixed on a single target. Marcus was scrambling backward, his face pale with terror, his precious obsidian shard clutched in his hand. He had nowhere left to run. The two of them, king and queen, predator and enigma, cornered him against the cold stone of the empty throne. Chapter 22. Throne of Storms and Silence. Marcus scrambled backward, his face a mask of waxy terror, and tripped over the steps of the dais. He fell in a heap at the foot of the massive empty throne. The obsidian shard skittered from his grasp. He was a snake, defanged and cornered. The hall was dead silent, the remaining alphas watching, their expressions a mixture of fear and awe. Cain stood before him, a figure of impending judgment, his silver eyes cold as a winter moon. Cora remained at Cain's side, a silent, unmovable anchor. "It was for the kingdom!" Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking. "Your father, he grew soft, and you were lost to your curse. I did what had to be done to preserve our strength." "Strength?" Cain's voice was dangerously quiet, a low whisper that cut through the hall more effectively than any shout. "You call this strength? Hiding in shadows, poisoning a throne, twisting a man's pain into a leash for your own ambition? You know nothing of the word." He took a step forward. "The sickness in this kingdom wasn't my curse. It was you." With a desperate cry, Marcus lunged for the obsidian shard, but Cora was faster. She focused her will, and a bubble of her nullifying silence enveloped the artifact. The sickly, purple light winked out. Its power was gone, smothered by her void. Marcus's hand froze above the now inert piece of rock, his last hope extinguished. He looked up at her, his eyes full of a new, dawning horror. He finally understood what she was. Not a witch, not a cure, but an ending. Cain's justice was swift and absolute, but before he delivered it, he looked at Cora. And in front of the entire assembly of alphas, the most powerful beings in their world, he laid his soul bare. "They called you a void," he said, his voice raw with an emotion that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with reverence. "They were wrong. The void was in me. A hollow space filled with nothing but noise and pain and shadows." He reached out and cupped her face, his touch impossibly gentle. "You are not the absence of a soul. You are the only thing that makes mine whole." And with that, he leaned in, and he kissed her. It was not a kiss of simple passion. It was a kiss of claiming, of destiny, of two fractured souls finally locking into place. The bond between them flared, a visible aura of silver and shadow that washed over the entire hall. It was a declaration more powerful than any law. When he pulled back, the look in his eyes was primal, feral. The time for words was over. He turned her slightly, exposing the delicate skin of her neck. A collective gasp went through the hall. They knew what was coming. This was the ultimate rite, the marking. He didn't hesitate. He lowered his head, and she felt the hot puff of his breath against her skin, a shiver tracing its path down her spine. Then, His fangs, sharp and definitive, pierced her skin. It was not a bite of aggression, but of ultimate possession. A jolt of pure white-hot energy shot through her, a fire that burned away the last remnants of the broken, wolfless girl and forged the queen in its place. His power, his essence, his very name seemed to flood into her, marking her soul as his. In return, her calming, balancing essence flowed into him, a permanent anchor in what was once a raging storm. He pulled away, licking the single drop of blood from her skin, and lifted his head to the stunned alphas. A low, possessive growl rumbled in his chest. Mine. The word was unspoken, but every single soul in the room heard it. Chapter 23. Ashes and Order. In the aftermath of the climax, a new order was forged in the Great Hall. Marcus and his co-conspirators were taken away, their fate a grim whisper that would serve as a warning for generations. The obsidian artifact, now just a dull piece of rock, was shattered to dust under Cain's heel. The immediate threat was gone, but the political landscape of their world had been irrevocably altered. The Alphas, who had arrived ready to challenge a weakened king, now looked upon Cain and Cora with a new, profound respect born of terror and awe. They had not just witnessed a coup being thwarted, they had witnessed the birth of a new kind of power. Cain, with Cora standing proudly at his side, her hand in his, addressed the assembly. His voice was clear and steady, free of the strain of his former torment. He spoke of the betrayal that had festered in his court for a generation, of the curse that had been used to manipulate the throne. And he spoke of Cora, not as his savior, but as his partner, the prophesied balance to the royal line's volatile power. He was rewriting their laws, their history, their future, all in a single, unwavering speech. Then, he called for the final piece of business. Liam. Two of Cain's guards dragged the former Alpha heir forward and threw him to the floor at their feet. Liam was a pathetic sight, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a trembling, terrified boy. He wouldn't look at them. He just stared at the stone floor, his body shaking. His fate, Cain announced, his voice echoing in the now silent hall, is not mine to decide. He turned his silver gaze, now softened with a love that was a weapon in its own right, to Cora. It is his queen's. All eyes turned to her. This was her test, her first act as Luna of their new era. The broken girl inside her screamed for vengeance, for a punishment as public and humiliating as the one he had dealt her. She could demand his life. She could have him exiled, shamed, destroyed. The power was hers. She looked down at the trembling form of the boy who had shattered her world, and she felt nothing. The burning hatred, the shame, the pain. It was all gone, burned away by the marking, by the truth of who she now was. He was a ghost from a life that was no longer hers. He was small and insignificant, and vengeance was a currency he was too poor to pay. Strip him of his alpha status and his family name, Cora said, her voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority that filled the entire hall. Send him to the northernmost border to serve as a lone patrolman for the rest of his days. He craved the power of a pack, so he will live with the silence of none. She looked at Liam one last time. He will live with the knowledge of what he threw away. That is a greater punishment than any death I could devise. A murmur of approval went through the crowd. It was a judgment not of blind fury, but of cold, poetic justice. It was the judgment of a queen. Chapter 24. The Keeper of the Curse. The Great Hall was empty now, the Alphas departed, the traitors imprisoned. The only sounds were the crackling of the torches and their own soft footsteps as they walked toward their new chambers. The weight of the day, of the battle, of their entire tumultuous journey, finally began to settle upon Cora's shoulders. She was a queen. She was his mate. She was whole. But a final unspoken threat lingered in the air between them. Inside their chambers, a fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow over the room. It was a space of comfort and peace. a sanctuary. Cain closed the door, shutting out the rest of the world. He turned to her, his silver eyes searching her face. The raw, primal power of the Alpha King was still there, but it was tempered now by a profound tenderness that was for her and her alone. "It's not truly gone, is it?" she whispered, already knowing the answer. "The curse." He shook his head, a shadow of the old pain flickering in his eyes. "Marcus and his artifact amplified it, but the original taint, it remains. It is woven into my blood, into the all-bond itself. You have quieted it, anchored it, but it is still there. A sleeping serpent." She knew what she had to do. The seer's final prophecy, the warning that had felt like a burden, now felt like a gift. It was her final choice, the ultimate expression of her power and her love. This was not a sacrifice. It was a fulfillment. She stepped closer, placing her palm flat against his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat. "The seer told me what a void was for," she said, her voice soft but sure. "She said it was born with room enough to hold a king's soul." Cora met his gaze and poured all of her love, her acceptance, her unwavering certainty into her own. "And to contain any darkness that threatens it." Before he could protest, before he could argue that she had already done enough, she reached inward, to the core of her power. She opened the final door of her soul and called to the ancient, sleeping serpent in his. She did not fight it. She welcomed it. She felt a deep, profound cold seep into her, the feeling of 1,000 years of pain and malice. It was a terrible, heavy weight, but it did not consume her. Her void, now filled with the light and warmth of his love, surrounded the darkness, contained it, and held it in a permanent, unbreachable stasis. It was still there, a cold stone in the deep well of her soul, but it was powerless, forever balanced by the love he had given her. Cain let out a shuddering breath, a tear tracing a path down his stoic face. He felt it leave him, the last shadow of the generational curse, the final echo of the noise. He was truly, finally, free. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair, his massive body trembling with the sheer, overwhelming relief of it all. He held her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "Do you feel it?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The darkness? The pain?" Cora leaned into his touch, a soft, radiant smile on her lips. She placed her hand over his heart, the heart she now kept safe. "No," she whispered, the last word she would ever need to say on the matter. "All I can feel is you."